Have you ever noticed how we carry within us an invisible authority that judges every thought, every action, every choice we make? An inner voice that never sleeps, that is always watching, always weighing, always deciding whether we are worthy or unworthy, clean or dirty, saved or damned. And that voice doesn't need a temple. It doesn't need a priest. It doesn't need a holy book because it is older than any religion, deeper than any doctrine, more powerful than any external law. And you can flee churches. You can reject traditions. You can deny faith. But from this inner voice, there is no escape because it is you and it is not you at the same time. It rules from the invisible throne that is exactly in the center of your chest. And Simone Weil, that French Jewish philosopher who died at the age of 34, but saw deeper into the human soul than most can in a lifetime, dedicated her last years to unearthing something that is hidden between the lines of the Bible, something that rabbis don't want to admit and that pastors avoid mentioning because it is too dangerous, too liberating, too radical. And what she discovered was this: the Bible is not primarily about God out there judging you from afar. It is about the inner government of conscience, about this supreme court that sits 24 hours a day inside your own soul. And you, right now, as you read these words, are being judged by that court, are being weighed on these invisible scales. And the verdict has been given thousands of times today without you even realizing it, because you condemned yourself when you looked in the mirror in the morning and didn't like what you saw. You absolved when you helped someone and felt that heat in your chest. You punished yourself when you repeated that pattern that you swore never to repeat again. And this internal court does not follow written laws. It operates on a logic deeper, older, truer than any external moral code. Have you ever wondered why certain transgressions destroy you inside while others slip away without leaving a mark? Why you can lie to the whole world and sleep peacefully, but you can't lie to yourself without something inside you slowly starting to rot? Why the severest punishment never comes from outside, but always from within. From that voice that doesn't need to shout to be heard, that doesn't need to threaten to be feared, that is simply there, observing, recording, governing. And Simone Weil realized that when the Bible talks about God knowing the secrets of the heart, it's not talking about an external being spying on your thoughts. It's talking about that conscience that you can't deceive, that judge who sees everything because he's part of you, but is also beyond you. And if you feel that those words are touching something deep inside you, something you didn't even know was waiting to be said, so subscribe to this channel now, because we're going to explore together what Simone Weil discovered about this hidden dimension of spirituality, about how the Bible is less about external rules and more about this internal dynamic of self-government, of self-judgment, of self-discovery. And you won't want to miss what comes next, because what she saw about conscience, about sacred guilt, about the invisible court that each of us bears, will completely change the way you read, not just the Bible, but the way you read your own life, your own history, your own wounds that never completely healed because the inner judge never truly forgave. Perhaps you have been carrying for years a specific guilt that no one else remembers, that no one else mentions, that perhaps wasn't even that serious in the eyes of the world, but that for you is an indelible stain on your soul. Something you did or didn't do, something you said or remained silent, something you chose or rejected, and this guilt is nowhere outside of you. It is not recorded in a heavenly archive. It is not set in stone. It exists only and solely in the court of your conscience. But there it is, more real than any external condemnation could to be, because you remember, you carry the weight of having been the traitor to your own integrity. And Simone Weil understood that this type of guilt is not a psychological neurosis that needs to be medicated or therapy that needs to be dissolved. It is something much deeper and much more sacred. It is the functioning of the inner government of conscience that the Bible describes in code, but that few decode correctly. Because when David writes in Psalm 51, "Against you I have sinned, against you only have I sinned," he is not speaking technically correctly, since his sin hurt Bathsheba. It killed Uriah. It caused real harm to real people. But David is revealing something brutal about the nature of sin. The real crime happens in the conscience. The real court is within. The real condemnation is the one you can't escape, because the judge everywhere you go. You sleep when you sleep, you wake up when you wake up, and you can confess to a priest. You can apologize to victims. You can do public penance, but if the internal judge doesn't hit the hammer of absolution, you will remain condemned regardless of how many people forgive you out there. And perhaps you know that feeling of being forgiven by everyone but yourself, of having made peace with the world, but not with that voice that never sleeps inside your chest, of having fulfilled every external demand, but still feel the weight of the internal sentence that has never been revoked. And Simone Weil would say that you are experiencing exactly what the Bible tries to describe when it talks about being far from God. It is not geographical or metaphysical distance. It is the inner exile of those who have lost the good graces of the government of their own conscience, of those who have been banished from the internal paradise, where you can look at yourself and not feel shame, not feel disgust, not feel despair, because true hell is not a place of fire and brimstone after death. True hell is living, daily under condemnation from the court that you cannot bribe, from the judge that you cannot deceive, from the sentence that you cannot ignore because it pulses in your blood, breathes in your chest, looks through your eyes every time you see yourself reflected in a mirror or in someone else's gaze. Simone Weil was born in Paris in the year 1999 into a secular Jewish family. She grew up under the shadow of her older brother André, who was an internationally recognized mathematical genius, and at the age of 14, she had an existential crisis so profound that she considered suicide because she thought she would never be as brilliant as her brother, would never reach the ultimate truth that he seemed to touch through numbers. But what almost killed her in that moment of adolescent despair eventually became her greatest strength, because Simone realized that her supposed intellectual inferiority forced her to seek truth in ways that geniuses like André never had to go. She could not achieve truth by sheer mental capacity, so she had to achieve it through suffering, through attention, through a brutal honesty with herself that accepted no comfortable lie, no consoling illusion, no easy escape. And it was this inability to lie to herself that led her to explore what she called the true reading of the Bible. Not as a historical document, not as a moral rule, not as ancient mythology, but as an accurate map of the inner government of human consciousness. And Weil was not a Christian in the sense conventional. She refused baptism until her death. Despite deep mystical experiences with Christ, she remained technically Jewish but universalist in soul. And this border position, this being between worlds, allowed her to see things that those who are completely within the tradition cannot see, because when you are too inside, you accept ready-made interpretations, you swallow dogmas without chewing, you repeat what you were taught without questioning whether it makes sense with your real experience of consciousness. But Weil did not have blind loyalty to any tradition. She had only fierce loyalty to truth, and the truth she found in the Bible was not about God up there commanding human puppets. It was about something much more intimate and much more terrible. The autonomous government of consciousness that operates according to laws that no one wrote, but everyone knows, that no one taught, but everyone feels, that no external authority can nullify because that authority comes from within, comes from the part of you that is more you than your ego could ever be. And when you violate the laws of that internal government, when you act against what that deeper part knows to be true, no religious confession can erase the truth. Sentence: no ritual can clean the stain. No external authority can absolve you because the crime happened in a jurisdiction where only you have the power to forgive yourself. And that forgiveness doesn't come easily. It doesn't come automatically. It doesn't come because someone said magic words. It only comes when you genuinely go through the process that conscience demands. The process that Weil saw, described metaphorically throughout the Bible, but especially in Job, in David, in Isaiah, in Jesus. This process of descent, of confrontation, of purification that cannot be skipped, it cannot be accelerated, it cannot be falsified. Now, let's go deeper. Let's enter the first level of this inner government of consciousness that Simone Weil discovered encoded in the Bible. And the first level is this: there is within you an unwritten law that you did not choose, but that chose you. A law that exists before any moral teaching, before any religious code, before any social rule. And this law does not need to be taught because it is already inscribed in the fabric of your consciousness. You are born knowing. You have always known, even when you don't pretend you don't know, and the Bible calls this in different ways. Paul speaks of the law written in hearts. Jeremiah speaks of the new covenant, where God writes law within people. And Simone Weil realized that these texts are not talking about a future supernatural miracle. They are describing a present reality that has always existed. This reality that there is in every human being an internal moral compass that does not need a sacred book to function, does not need religious authority to validate, does not need the threat of eternal punishment to operate, because it operates automatically, inevitably, constantly. You can try to ignore it, but you cannot turn it off. You can try to deceive it, but it sees through every lie. You can try to negotiate with it, but it does not accept bribes. And this internal law has a very specific characteristic that external laws do not have. It judges you not just by actions, but by intentions. Not just by results, but by motivations. Not just by doing wrong, but by being false. Because the inner government of conscience does not care about appearances. It is not impressed by public performances, does not accept theatrical virtue that you display to an audience while your heart is rotten inside. And Jesus attacked Pharisees not because they broke the law of Moses, but because they obeyed external law perfectly while violating internal law completely. They decimated even herbs from the garden, but neglected justice and mercy. They washed the outside of the cup, but the inside was filthy. They were whitewashed tombs on the outside, but full of dead bones on the inside. And Simone Weil saw in these attacks of Jesus not religious moralism, but accurate description of how inner government of conscience works. You can deceive everyone. You can build an impeccable reputation. You can be admired as a virtuous person. But if you are violating internal law, if you are betraying your own conscience, the inner judge knows the invisible court records, and the sentence will be carried out, not by God outside, but by the part of you that cannot live in peace with falsehood. You have experienced this. You have certainly experienced it. Those moments when you do everything right in the eyes of others, but feel inside that you are completely wrong. When you receive praise for something that you know was done with impure motivation. When you are congratulated for virtue that you know is just a mask hiding vice. And in those moments, external praise does not reach you, does not console you. In fact, it makes everything worse because it increases the abyss between how the world sees you and how you see yourself, between public reputation and internal reality. And this abyss is a source of specific suffering that no therapy can cure, no antidepressant can alleviate, no external achievement can compensate, because the problem is not out there. It is here inside, in court, that works 24 hours a day, weighing not your actions but your being, not your performance but your truth, not your image but your essence. And Simone Weil would say that when the Bible speaks of God seeing the heart and not appearances, it is talking exactly about this internal dynamic, this impossibility of deceiving oneself, this supreme court of conscience that does not accept falsification, no matter how convincing it is to the external world. And the first great truth that Weil extracted from the Bible is this: you cannot live in peace as long as there is discrepancy between who you intend to be and who you really are, between what you show and what you hide, between your public face and your private truth. Because the inner government of consciousness demands coherence, demands integrity in the literal sense of the word, demands that all parts of you are integrated, aligned, honest with each other. And when you break that integrity, when you divide yourself into persona for public and truth for private, something inside you begins to die. It is not dramatic death. It is slow, imperceptible death. But it is real death, death of the soul, that while I considered it worse than the death of the body. Because the body dies once, but the soul can die 1,000 times while the body still breathes. The soul can rot completely while you continue to function externally, going to work, fulfilling obligations, maintaining appearances. But inside, there is no longer anything alive, just automatic. Mechanism repeating empty gestures. And this death of the soul happens exactly when you lose contact with the inner government of conscience. When you stop listening to the internal judge, when you become so good at lying to yourself that you can no longer distinguish truth from fiction, sincerity from performance, being of appearance. And Weil saw people like that everywhere, people who had completely silenced the voice of conscience and now lived like soulless automatons, following external rules perfectly but completely dead inside, and she was terrified of these people, not because they were bad in the conventional sense, but because they were false so completely that they no longer realized their own falsehood. And the Bible is full of warnings against this state, against this death in life, against this falsehood that becomes second nature. And Jesus called these people living dead. Paul spoke of people who have a form of piety but deny its power. The prophets denounced sacrifices without sincerity, rituals without inner truth, external obedience masking internal rebellion. And what all these texts are pointing to is the fundamental law of the inner government of conscience. You do not can deceive you with impunity. You cannot falsify indefinitely. You cannot maintain discrepancy between being and appearing without something essential within you being destroyed in the process, and that destruction is the real hell, not future, not after death, but now, today. In this moment, living under condemnation from the judge, you cannot bribe because that judge is yourself in your truest, most naked, most ruthless form. But there is more. There is always more when you descend to the deep levels of this structure of consciousness that Simone Weil mapped, and the second level is this. The inner government of consciousness does not operate only with law, but with witnesses. There is within you not only a judge who condemns, but also a witness who observes everything, records everything, remembers everything, and this witness is implacable, not because he wants to destroy you, but because his function is to preserve truth, to prevent you from rewriting history, to prevent you from becoming a walking fiction that believes its own lies. And the Bible talks about this witness in various ways. It talks about God who searches hearts and kidneys, who knows secrets of the heart, who sees in secret. But Simone Weil realized that these texts do not describe external divine espionage. They describe the internal function of consciousness that keeps a precise record of who you really are versus who you intend to be. And this internal witness sees things that you can hide from everyone. She was there when you did that thing that you never told anyone. She heard that thought that you never verbalized. She felt that true motivation that you hid even from yourself. And there is no point in rationalizing. There is no point in justifying. There is no point in creating alternative narratives because the witness simply knows. She was there. She saw, she remembers. And you can fool your conscious mind. You can build edited memories where you are always hero or victim, but never villain. But the internal witness keeps an unedited file, raw version, naked truth. And that is why you can go years without thinking about a certain event. And suddenly something triggers memory, and the internal witness projects the complete film, uncensored, without favorable editing. And you are forced to see again who you really were in that moment. Not who you wish you had been. Not who you tell others you were. But who you really were when no one was watching except the witness who never blinks, never sleeps, never forgets. And Simone Weil understood that this witness function of conscience is what makes genuine repentance possible, but also what makes self-deception impossible in the long run, because you can deceive yourself for days, months, even years. But eventually the witness presents evidence, forces confrontation with truth, and in that moment, you have two choices: accept truth about yourself or fragment their psyche even more deeply to maintain a lie. And most people choose the second option because accepting the truth hurts too much, demands too much, destroys too much of their carefully constructed self-image. So they push the witness into the basement of their conscience, lock the door, throw away the key, and continue living as if the file didn't exist, as if the witness wasn't there, still observing, still recording, still accumulating evidence of falsehood. And Weil would say that this is the sin against the Holy Spirit that Jesus mentions. Not some specific transgression, but this systematic refusal of listening to the inner witness, this deliberate silencing of conscience, this slow murder of the ability to see truth about yourself. Because when you completely kill that capacity, when you destroy the inner witness so completely that it can no longer speak, you become impervious to transformation, incapable of genuine repentance, dead to the possibility of real change. And that is what makes sin unforgivable, not because God refuses to forgive, but because you have destroyed in yourself the capacity to recognize the need for forgiveness. You have killed the witness, so there is no one left inside to say, "I saw what you did," and needs to be fixed. And without that voice, you are forever trapped in the edited version of yourself, the falsified story, the fabricated identity that has no relationship to who you really are. You know people like that. Everyone does. People who never admit error, who always have ready justification, who constantly rewrite history to always come out as innocent or victims. People who live in a bubble of self-deception so complete that reality can no longer penetrate. And these people are not necessarily bad. They are often even functionally successful. But there is something dead in them, something essential that no longer breathes. And it is the internal witness. It is the ability to see truth about oneself. It is the inner government of consciousness that has been so brutally suppressed that it can no longer operate. And Simone Weil was terrified of to become this kind of person. She would rather die physically than die internally in this way. And it was this fear that led her to develop what she called attention. This practice of looking at herself without mercy, but also without cruelty, simply seeing what is, recognizing what was, accepting internal testimony, even when testimony condemns, even when the truth hurts, even when preferring a comfortable lie would be much easier. And before we go even deeper into this structure that Weil has mapped out, tell me now, where are you watching this video from? What city? What country? Because there is something profoundly important in knowing that at this very moment, spread across the world, there are others like you facing these same questions about conscience, about inner truth, about this invisible court that we all carry. Leave your location in the comments, because when you see that you are not alone in this struggle, to live with integrity, to hear the voice of conscience, to not kill the inner witness, something changes. You realize that this is not just your private battle, but a universal human battle, and perhaps Simone Weil, wherever she is, would be comforted in knowing that her discoveries about the inner government of consciousness continue to help people around the planet not to give up on living truthfully. So tell me where you follow us on this journey. Now, the third and deepest level of the inner government of consciousness that Simone Weil discovered, encoded in the Bible. And this is the most disturbing because it reveals that there is not enough internal law that judges you and an internal witness that records everything. There is also an internal executor who executes the sentence. And this executor is not sadistic, is not cruel, does not seek your suffering, but he is implacable because his function is to maintain the integrity of the system, to ensure that internal law is respected, to ensure that you cannot simply ignore the verdict of the invisible court and continue living as if nothing had happened. And the way the internal executor operates is subtle but devastating. It takes away peace. It removes the ability to rest. It eliminates the possibility of genuine satisfaction, and you continue functioning. You continue living. But something essential has been removed. You can achieve everything you ever wanted, but achievements do not bring real joy. You can be loved by many, but love does not truly reach you. You can have external success, but it sounds hollow internally, because the internal executor has blocked your access to the experience of plenitude, of peace, of being well within yourself. Indeed, and this is not arbitrary punishment. It is a necessary consequence of living under condemnation of one's own conscience. It is the inevitable result of having violated internal law and not having gone through the process of reparation that conscience demands. And Simone Weil saw this described throughout the Bible. She saw in Cain that after killing Abel, he could no longer rest and wandered the earth as a fugitive, even though no one else knew of his crime. He saw in David that after adultery and murder, he wrote psalms of deep anguish where bones dried up and there was no peace. He saw in Judas that after betraying Jesus, could not live on the money from betrayal and hanged himself because the internal executioner made existence unbearable. And these are not just moralizing stories about bad people being punished. They are accurate descriptions of how the internal self-correction mechanism of conscience works when you seriously violate internal law and do not go through the process of genuine reparation. The internal executioner removes you from grace, exiles you from the inner paradise where it is possible to be at peace with yourself. And this exile is real hell, not metaphor, not future threat, but present experience of being separated from your own essence, of not being able to fully inhabit your own life, of always being running away from something that lives inside you and therefore can never be escaped. You can go to another country. You can change your name. You can rebuild your life completely. but the inner executor travels with you because he is you, the deepest part of you that does not accept falsehood, does not tolerate betrayal of integrity, does not allow you to live in peace as long as there is this fundamental discrepancy between who you are and who you should be according to the internal law that you yourself recognize as true. And the most terrifying thing about internal executor is that it cannot be negotiated, cannot be, and deceived, cannot be bribed, because he wants nothing from you except truth, integrity, alignment between being and doing, between internal and external, between recognized law and lived law. And as long as this alignment does not happen, as long as you do not go through the process that conscience demands, the internal executor will continue its relentless function of keeping you exiled from peace. And Simone Weil understood that most of the psychological sufferings that people experience are not illnesses that require medication, but are executions of internal sentences. They are manifestations of the executor of conscience doing its job and medicating it. Trying to suppress symptoms without dealing with the cause is like taking painkillers while there is a thorn in the flesh. It may relieve pain temporarily, but the thorn is still there. Infection continues to grow, and eventually the body will reject any painkiller because real wound needs to be treated. Thorn needs to be removed. And in the case of the inner government of conscience, the thorn is the unrepaired violation. It is the unresolved internal crime. It is unconfronted falsehood. It is broken integrity not restored. And removing that thorn hurts. It hurts terribly. It requires you to look directly at what you have done. Acknowledge without excuses. Accept the real weight of your action or omission. Go through a process of genuine transformation that cannot be faked or accelerated, but only by going through this process, only by truly removing the thorn, can the internal executor finally cease his function. Only then can a sentence be fulfilled or genuine forgiveness granted. Only then can you return from exile and inhabit once again the inner paradise where it is possible to be at peace with yourself, even sleeping without nightmares, looking in the mirror without shame, existing without carrying the constant weight of invisible but devastating condemnation. And what Weil discovered, what she saw encoded in biblical narratives, is that the process of restoring the inner government of consciousness cannot be skipped. It cannot be replaced by external rituals. It cannot be outsourced to religious authorities, because the internal executor only responds to genuine transformation, only recognizes real repentance, only accepts true change that comes from within and manifests itself throughout your life, not just in verbal confession or symbolic gesture, but in complete reconstruction of how you live, of who you are, of how you relate to the internal law that you were violating. And this process is long, it is painful, it is humiliating, it is the opposite of everything that modern culture sells about quick forgiveness, about moving forward, about leaving the past behind. Because you can't just leave the past behind when internal witness recorded everything and internal executor is serving sentence. You can only cross. You can only transform. You can only die to the version of you that committed internal crime and be reborn as something new, something that you are finally aligned with the law that you always knew to be true but were violating. And this rebirth, this profound transformation, is what the Bible calls salvation. Not an external magical event, but an internal, painful process of restoring the government of consciousness, of reintegrating the fragmented self, of returning from exile to the inner home, where finally, for the first time in a long time, you can rest. What Simone Weil discovered by observing her own conscience and studying biblical texts with brutal honesty is that the specific pain of living under internal condemnation teaches you something you cannot learn any other way. You need integrity to live, not imposed external morality, not performance of virtue for an audience, but real coherence between all parts of you, genuine alignment between what you know to be true and how you live. And the pain of internal condemnation exists precisely because you already know what you should do. You already recognize internal law as legitimate. You already understand that you have violated something sacred within yourself, and no matter how much you try to rationalize, justify, minimize, a deep part of you refuses to accept these excuses, and this refusal is what hurts. This impossibility of completely deceiving yourself is what corrodes. This witness that cannot be silenced is what tortures, because it forces you to live divided, part of you wanting to believe the convenient narrative while another part knows it is a lie, and you cannot live like this indefinitely without something breaking, without your psyche fragmenting, without your soul. To get sick will experience this directly during her brief life. She had had intense headaches since adolescence that no doctor could explain or cure, and she came to believe that they were physical punishment for her moral failures, for times when her attention failed, for times when she could not live up to the brutal standard that conscience demanded of her. And although today we can see in this elements of psychological self-flagellation that would need therapy, Weil was also touching upon seeing deep reality. Body does not lie. Body manifests what soul is experiencing, and when soul is under condemnation from the inner government of consciousness, body often expresses this through symptoms that medicine cannot explain because they are not primary physical dysfunctions, but somatic manifestations of spiritual conflict. Have you ever noticed how certain periods of your life, when you were living in deep internal contradiction, your body simply collapsed in mysterious ways? How illnesses appeared without a clear cause? How pain set in with no identifiable physical origin? How deep fatigue consumed you even when I slept enough hours? Because the body was carrying the weight of the internal sentence, it was externally manifesting the internal exile. It was screaming in the language of symptoms, what conscience was whispering in the language of guilt. And modern medicine often treats symptoms but ignores the source, prescribes medication to silence physical manifestation, but does not touch on the spiritual conflict that is generating manifestation. It is like turning off a fire alarm without putting out the fire. And Simone Weil insisted that we need to listen to what the body is saying, pay attention to what symptoms are revealing, because they are often the last desperate cries of the inner government of the consciousness, trying to force confrontation with truth that the conscious mind refuses to face. And the brutal lesson that the pain of internal condemnation comes to teach is this: you were not made to live divided. You were not designed to carry a fundamental contradiction between being and appearing. You cannot prosper as long as there is a civil war within you between the part that knows the truth and the part that wants to deny it. And this war exhausts you more than any physical work could. It drains you more than any external crisis could drain, because it is war without truce, without rest, without the possibility of victory, while, if you do not make peace through surrender to the truth, through radical acceptance of what the inner witness has recorded and what the inner judge has concluded, and when you finally accept it, when you stop fighting against the verdict of your own conscience, when you acknowledge genuine guilt without trying to minimize or excuse it, something extraordinary can happen. Not immediately, not magically, but eventually, the inner doer can begin to relax its vigilance. The exile can begin to dissolve. The possibility of peace can return because you have demonstrated through sincere acceptance and genuine transformation that is finally taking seriously the inner government of consciousness, finally respecting internal law that has always been there, finally living with integrity that has always been a fundamental requirement for the well-being of the soul. But this brings us to the question that Simone Weil has wrestled with more intensely than any other. How do you live with a consciousness of genuine guilt that cannot be erased, with a knowledge of violation that cannot be undone, with a memory of betrayal that cannot be forgotten? And here, Weil offers not cheap consolation, but brutal dignity. She says that you will not wake up one day and find that guilt is gone, that the past has been erased, that you can simply move on as if nothing had happened, because the inner witness does not forget, the inner doer does not. Amnesia, the inner government of consciousness, does not offer a complete reset as if you could restart the game. Instead, what Weil proposes is something much more difficult, but also much more true. You learn to carry guilt differently, not as a weight that paralyzes you, but as knowledge that teaches you, not as condemnation that defines you, but as truth that humiliates you in a sacred way. You stop running away from guilt and begin to inhabit it differently, recognizing that yes, you did that. Yes, you were that person. Yes, you violated something sacred, and no amount of regret can undo what has been done. But you can transform yourself into a person who would not do that again, not because you are afraid of punishment, but because you genuinely changed, genuinely grew, genuinely became something different through the brutal process of confronting the truth about yourself without apology. And that transformation does not erase the past, but creates real discontinuity between who you were and who you have become. And it is this discontinuity that the inner doer eventually recognizes and accepts, not because he was deceived, but because transformation is real, change is genuine. You are literally no longer the same person who committed that act, that violation, that betrayal. You have died to that version of yourself, and something new has been born. Something that carries memory and scar, but no longer carries identity as a transgressor. And Weil saw this as the death and resurrection described by Paul. Not a future mystical event, but a present psychological process that can happen many times throughout your life whenever you confront truth about yourself, goes through the pain of genuine recognition, and emerges transformed on the other side. But she was also brutally honest about the fact that some guilts are so deep, some violations are so serious, that you will carry them for a lifetime, and may never experience complete forgiveness from the doer within, may always live with a degree of exile, with the taste of ash in your mouth when there should be sweetness. And this is not cosmic injustice. It is simply the reality that some actions have permanent consequences, not just out there in the world, but here, within the structure of consciousness, and all you can do is live as truly as possible with this knowledge. Honor the weight of what you have done, not through constant self-flagellation, but through a life lived with the greatest possible integrity, through refusal to commit that kind of violation again, through genuine transformation that does not erase the past, but creates a different future. And there is dignity in that. There is nobility in carrying real guilt without denying it, but also without letting it completely destroy you, in living with a visible scar instead of pretending that it was never hurt. Existed in accepting that you are a person who did that, but are no longer condemned to be just that, because who you have become through the process of confrontation and transformation is also real, also valid, also part of your story that the internal witness records along with transgression, and perhaps with time, a lot of time. The internal executor can relax sentence, not because he has forgotten, but because he sees that you have not forgotten, have not run away, have not denied, but have faced and changed, and that is all that the inner government of consciousness really requires. Not impossible perfection, but radical honesty and transformation, genuine. Simone Weil also discovered something disturbing about grace, and here she was directly confronting conventional Christian interpretations that she found dangerously simplistic, because churches talk about grace as if it were a free gift that God gives independent of human merit, and technically that is true in their theology. But Weil realized that this theological truth masks a more complex psychological reality. You cannot receive genuine grace. You cannot experience real forgiveness from the inner government of conscience, while part of you is still defending, justifying, minimizing, because grace can only enter where there is emptiness, created by total recognition of guilt, by complete acceptance of condemnation, by absolute abandonment of all self-defense. And this is the opposite of how most people seek forgiveness. Most want to be absolved without first being truly condemned, want grace without judgment, want salvation without admitting need to be saved, because admitting genuine need for salvation requires that you first recognize how lost you really are, how guilty you genuinely are, how deep a violation you have committed, and ego refuses to do that because ego needs to maintain an image of itself as fundamentally good, as essentially innocent, as a victim of circumstances or a product of environment, but never as genuinely guilty of real transgression against internal law that you yourself recognize as valid. So ego negotiates, rationalizes, creates complex narratives where you are always less guilty than you really are, always more justified than you really were. And as long as ego is doing that, as long as there is this subtle but constant defense going on, grace cannot enter because there is no real space for it. There is no genuine emptiness. There is no honest recognition of absolute necessity. And Simone Weil called this decreation, this process of undoing defensive ego, of allowing every protective construct to be dissolved, of standing naked before one's conscience with no fig leaf covering shame, and only in this complete nakedness, in this total vulnerability, in this radical acceptance of righteous condemnation, can something like grace happen, not because you deserved it, but precisely because you stopped trying to deserve it, not because you are good, but because you finally admitted that you are not. Not because you did something right, but because you fully recognized what you did wrong without any extenuating excuse. And in that moment of total recognition, of complete acceptance, of absolute surrender to the truth of one's own transgression, internal executor. Sometimes, not always, not guaranteed, but sometimes it can relax vigilance, it can open the possibility of reintegration, it can allow return from exile, not because you have convinced him that he does not deserve punishment, but because you have finally accepted that he deserves it. And paradoxically, it is this complete acceptance of the justice of the sentence that opens the door to the possibility of mercy, because now mercy is not a denial of justice, but something that transcends justice. It is not a declaration of innocence, but recognition that you, even if guilty, even justly condemned, can still be transformed, can still be are. Once you are healed, you can still return to live with integrity even while carrying a permanent memory of when you did not live. And Weil experienced this in flashes throughout her life. Moments when, after periods of brutal self-criticism, after mercilessly facing her own faults and weaknesses, she experienced something she could only describe as the presence of Christ. Not Christ of the churches, but Christ as the principle of love that descends to the lowest, even the most condemned, even the most lost. And this love does not deny condemnation, but indwells her, does not remove guilt, but transforms relationship with it. It does not erase the past, but it creates the possibility of a different future. And Weil said that this kind of grace cannot be sought directly. It cannot be achieved through spiritual techniques. It cannot be achieved through religious performance. It can only be received, and it can only be received by those who have created real space for it through complete decreation of the defensive ego. And this is radically different from how popular religion preaches grace, because popular religion wants you to feel good. It wants you to experience quick relief. It wants you to have immediate comfort. But Weil knew that real grace, genuine transformation, real salvation only comes after you have gone through hell of confronting total truth about yourself, only after you have accepted righteous verdict from the inner judge, only after you have completely stopped defending yourself and become exposed in your real guilt, and only then, perhaps, something may come down, something may touch, something may transform, but there is no guarantee, there is no formula. There is no technique that forces this. You can only create conditions through brutal honesty and waiting. Waiting without specific expectation. Waiting without demanding result. Waiting like someone. Accept that it may never come, but still remain faithful to the truth. And now we come to the practical part that Simone Weil developed not as a system, but as a way of life. Concrete practices not to manipulate the inner government of consciousness, but to live in honor of it, to respect its authority, to cooperate with its functioning instead of constantly resisting. And the first practice is what Weil called simply attention, which she described as the highest form of prayer even for atheists. And attention here does not mean forced concentration or intense focus. It means unarmed presence to what is, observation without judgment, but also without denial, the ability to see bare truth without immediately trying to change it, fix it, or run away from it. Then concrete practice is this. Take 10 minutes every day, in the morning if possible, when your mind is not yet completely dominated by the worries of the day, and simply sit silently and observe your thoughts, but not like meditation where the goal is to empty the mind. Instead, you are practicing being a conscious witness to your own consciousness. You are learning to listen to what the inner judge is saying. Pay attention to what the inner witness is remembering. Feel where the inner doer is causing discomfort, and when you notice that you are mentally defending yourself from some uncomfortable truth, simply observe this defense without judging, but also without giving into it. Observe how the ego automatically creates protective narratives, how the mind instantly seeks justifications, how you naturally try to soften internal condemnation and just observe. Don't try to stop, don't try to change, just see clearly the mechanism in action, because seeing clearly is the beginning of transformation. Awareness of the pattern is the first step to not being completely controlled by it. And the second practice that Weil developed was what she called reading, but not ordinary reading. It was reading as a form of attention. So take text that you recognize as containing deep truth. It could be the Bible if you have a relationship with it. It could be poetry. It could be philosophy. Anything that you know touches something real in you. And instead of reading quickly to absorb information, read a sentence and stop. A single sentence and dwell on it completely. Let it resonate. Feel where it touches. Notice what resistances it raises, and don't move forward until you have really allowed that sentence to sink in, until you have given it your full attention. And Weil said that a page read in this way with complete attention has more value than an entire book read distractedly, because it is not the quantity of information that transforms, but the quality of attention you bring. And the third practice, perhaps the most difficult, is to confess, but not confess to a priest or therapist necessarily. Confess to yourself first. Write on paper or type in a document that you will never share the truths that you normally hide, the transgressions that you minimize, the motivations that you disguise, and write without editing, without softening, without justifying, just naked truth as internal witness knows her. And not do this once, but regularly, weekly perhaps, because the process of decreation of the defensive ego is not a one-time event, but continuous practice. Every week, you discover new layers of self-deception that need to be confronted, new defenses that ego has built, new narratives that the mind has created to protect the image you have of yourself. And by writing truth without excuses, you are training the ability to be honest with yourself. You are strengthening the muscle of self-awareness that most people let atrophy. You are practicing living without masks, even when no one is looking except the inner witness who always saw through masks anyway. And fourth practice is to deliberately do something that the ego does not want to do. Not something self-destructive, but something that the ego considers beneath its dignity. Something that brings no reward. Something that no one will know you did. So there is no gain in reputation, and to do it only because it needs to be done, because it is right, because it serves something greater than the needs of the ego. And Weil practiced this by working in factories despite being a brilliant intellectual, refusing privileges that his social class offered, choosing solidarity with the oppressed not as a political performance, but as a spiritual practice of decreation, of deconstruction of the ego that always wants status, recognition, special position, and you can do a smaller version of that in your own life. Maybe clean public bathrooms that no one else wants to clean. Maybe help someone anonymously without the possibility of thanks. Maybe do necessary but invisible work that brings no credit. And the point is not to cultivate false humility or performance of virtue. The point is to confront and dissolve the ego's constant need to be special, to be recognized, to be above, because while ego demands this special position, you cannot really cooperate with the inner government of consciousness that demands equality fundamental of all in the face of internal law, which does not recognize privileges, which does not accept exceptions based on who you think you are. And fifth practice, perhaps the most important, is simply to stop lying. Start small if necessary. Stop telling convenient white lies. Stop exaggerating stories to seem more interesting. Stop omitting truths that would make you look worse. Stop distorting facts to serve your narrative. And this will seem impossible at first, because you will discover how much your social life depends on small falsehoods, how much your relationships are built on edited presentations of who you are, how much you automatically distort truth 1,000 times a day without even realizing it. But when you start paying attention and deliberately choose truth even when lying would be more convenient, something begins to change. Profoundly. Not just in how others see you, but in how you see yourself, in how you inhabit your own life. Because every time you choose truth, you are honoring the inner government of conscience. You are respecting inner law. You are cooperating with the inner judge instead of constantly trying to deceive it. And over time, a lot of time, this practice of consistent truth can begin to dissolve exile, can begin to restore integrity, can begin to allow you to return to inhabit your own life fully. Instead of always living one step behind your own lies, always keeping parallel stories, always wasting energy trying to remember what you said to whom and when you can finally live with one truth, when internal and external finally align, when you are the same person alone and with others, when there is no longer a need for masks because you are no longer hiding anything. There is peace in that no achievement external can provide. There is rest in this that no success can buy. There is fulfillment in this that is completely different from hedonic happiness or temporary pleasure. It is deep satisfaction of finally inhabiting your own life with integrity, of finally being at peace with the inner government of the consciousness that has always been there, always seen everything, always known truth, and now finally no longer needs to condemn because you have stopped transgressing, not because you have become holy, but because you have become honest, completely, radically, non-negotiably honest first with yourself and then with the world. And that honesty is the foundation on which any genuine life needs to be built. Without it, everything else is a sandcastle that the first wave of crisis will destroy. But with it, you have solid rock that can withstand any storm, because there is no more hidden thing that can be exposed, no more falsehood that can be revealed, no more discrepancy that can be explored. You are what you are, completely, and there is freedom in that, which is indescribable until you experience it for yourself. You've come this far, and that already says something about you. It says that you have the courage to look at aspects of existence that most Aurea avoids, that you are not satisfied with superficial answers about conscience and morality, that something inside you recognizes the importance of what Simone Weil discovered about the inner government of conscience. And maybe during these minutes we spent together, something changed. Maybe you felt recognition of truth that you already knew, but had never seen articulated in this way. Maybe you identified in your own life examples of how inner judge operates, how inner witness records, how inner executor punishes. And if something here resonated deeply, if you felt that these words were describing your own experience with precision that surprised you, so leave a like on this video because it shows me that these explorations of human consciousness through the philosophy of Simone Weil are reaching people who really need them, people who are willing to face the truth even when it hurts, people who value integrity over comfort, and subscribe to the channel as we continue this journey of deep exploration of the most difficult but also most essential aspects of the human experience, because there is so much more to discover about how to live with radical honesty, how to cooperate with the inner government of consciousness instead of constantly resisting it, like going through a painful but necessary process of genuine transformation, and you don't need to make this journey alone. There are others walking this same path, others struggling with the same issues, others seeking the same integrity, and together we can create a community of people who refuse to live falsely, even when falsehood would be easier, who choose truth even when truth hurts, who honor the inner government of conscience even when it requires sacrifices that the world does not understand. And now, having traversed together this territory of consciousness that Simone Weil mapped out with her life and work, it remains only to recognize something fundamental. What she discovered was not a self-help technique. It was not a method of personal growth. It was not an abstract philosophical system. It was an accurate description of how the deepest part of you works, the part that you cannot cheat, you cannot bribe, you cannot ignore indefinitely without devastating consequences. And the central message that Weil extracted from the Bible is not about God out there judging you. It is about this internal dynamic of self-government, that supreme court of conscience that operates according to laws that you did not write but recognize as valid, that you did not choose but accept as legitimate, that you cannot abolish but can choose to honor or violate. And each violation has a cost. Each transgression has a consequence, not because the universe is cruel, but because integrity is a fundamental requirement for the well-being of the soul. It is impossible to genuinely prosper while you are divided against yourself, impossible to have real peace while you are under condemnation from the inner judge, impossible to inhabit your own life fully while you are exiled of the inner paradise where it is possible to be at peace with yourself. And the way back is not easy. It is not quick. It is not painless. It demands brutal confrontation with truth about who you have been. It demands complete acceptance of the justice of internal condemnation. It demands absolute surrender of every ego defense mechanism. It demands death of the counterfeit version of you so that something true can finally be born. But there is no shortcut. There is no substitute. There is no way to skip this process and still achieve real integrity, genuine peace, a fully inhabited life. You can try 1,000 different techniques. You can seek 1,000 forms of temporary relief. But eventually, you will have to go back and face what the internal witness recorded, what the internal judge concluded, what the internal executor is demanding. Because the inner government of conscience does not go away. It cannot be outsourced. It does not accept representatives. Only you can make peace with yourself. Only you can go through the transformation process that conscience demands. Only you can restore integrity that was broken. And Simone Weil only lived 34 years. But in that time, she faced it with courage that few possess. She refused to live falsely, even when falsehood would have made her life so much easier. She maintained brutal fidelity to the truth, even when truth condemned her. She cooperated with the inner government of conscience, even when it required sacrifices that the world considered excessive or even insane. And she died young. She died in exile. She died alone. But she died with her integrity intact. She died at peace with her inner judge. She died having honored to the end the inner law that she recognized as sacred. And perhaps this is the only real success that matters in the end, not how. Many years you lived, but whether you lived with truth, not what you achieved externally, but whether you maintained integrity internally. Not how the world saw you, but whether you can look at yourself without shame, as in self-deception, without the need for masks or lies. And this is not an impossible ideal. It is not unattainable perfection. It is simply a constant choice to honor the inner government of conscience, to respect internal law, to live with as much honesty as you can today, knowing that tomorrow you will discover new forms of self-deception that need to be confronted, new defense mechanisms that need to be dissolved, new layers of falsehood that need to be removed, because the process of living with integrity does not end. It does not reach an endpoint where you can relax and declare victory. It is a journey, continuous. It is daily practice. It is moment-by-moment choice of truth over convenient lie, of honesty over comfortable performance, of being real over appearing impressive. And there is dignity in that. There is nobility in simply continuing to choose truth even when no one is applauding, even when the world doesn't understand, even when it would be so much easier to lie. Because in the end, you don't respond to the world, you respond to the judge within, to the witness who saw it all, to the inner government of conscience that always knew who you really were beneath all the masks, and to make peace with that government, to live in harmony with this inner law, inhabiting your own life with complete integrity. This is what Simone Weil found to be the essence of all true spirituality, no matter what name you give it, no matter what tradition you follow or reject. Because in the end, it all comes down to this. You can look at yourself without running away. You can inhabit your own life. Without shame, you can rest in the awareness that you are what you say you are. You do what you say you do. You live what you say you believe. And there is no fundamental discrepancy between who you are alone and who you are with, between what you think and what you say, between what you feel and what you do. And when you finally achieve that alignment, even if imperfect, even if always in process, there is peace in this that is completely different from any external pleasure or success. It is peace of finally being at home within yourself, of finally inhabiting your own life fully, of finally being free from the internal exile that you didn't even know you were living in until you experience what it is to return. And perhaps that is the final message that Simone Weil left, not through a complete philosophical system because she died before she could complete it, but through a life lived with fierce integrity, through an absolute refusal to lie to herself even when the truth hurt, unbearably, through total fidelity to the inner government of conscience even when it cost everything, and that life, however brief and difficult it may have been, is testimony to what is possible when you choose truth above all, when you honor internal law above all external convenience, when you live with constant attention to what the inner judge says, to what inner witness remembers, what the inner doer demands, because in the end, there is no other way to real peace. There is no other method. To genuine wholeness, There is no other process to true salvation except this. Confront brutal truth about oneself. Accept righteous condemnation from the inner government of conscience. Go through counterfeit ego death and emerge on the other side transformed, not perfect, not without scars, not without memory of what was, but finally, able to live with honesty, with integrity, with deep peace of one who has made peace with the harsher and more severe inner judge. Merciful that exists, the judge that is yourself in your truest, most naked, deepest form.